He was the toughest promoter in professional wrestling, a man who believed the business should look like a fight, not a circus. He banned dancing, he mocked glitter, he fired guys for smiling too much. If you couldn't legitimately handle yourself in a bar fight, he didn't want you in his territory. His wrestlers were ex-football players, amateur champions, and certified tough guys. And then one day, a 300-pound man walked into his office in Shreveport, Louisiana. A man who couldn't execute a headlock takeover cleanly. A man whose entire arsenal consisted of a headbutt, a power slam, and a smile. A man who would eventually enter arenas pushing a shopping cart full of garbage while disco music played. By every rule this promoter had ever lived by, this man should have been shown the door in 5 minutes. Instead, the promoter looked at him and saw the future. He bet his entire company on him. He broke a barrier that every other promoter in America told him would destroy his business. And together, in the deep South of all places, they created something that professional wrestling had never seen before and has arguably never seen since. The promoter was Cowboy Bill Watts. The man in his office was Sylvester Ritter. And the story of how the most old-school hardliner in wrestling history built his empire around the flashiest performer alive is one of the most fascinating contradictions the business has ever produced. This is the story of Bill Watts and the Junkyard Dog. To understand why this partnership should have been impossible, you first have to understand exactly who Bill Watts was. Because Bill Watts wasn't just a promoter with opinions, he was a true believer, a fundamentalist, a man whose entire worldview was built on one unshakable principle. Wrestling only works if people believe it's real, and people only believe it's real if the men in the ring look like they could actually hurt you. William F. Watts Jr. was born on May 5, 1939, in Oklahoma. He grew up big, mean, and athletic in a part of the country where those three qualities opened every door that mattered. He played football at the University of Oklahoma during the era when the Sooners were the most feared program in college football. He was a legitimate athlete with legitimate credentials, and he carried himself accordingly. When football didn't pan out into a long professional career, Watts found his way into professional wrestling in the early 1960s, and he was perfect for it. 6'3", close to 300 pounds, a face like a clenched fist. He worked as Cowboy Bill Watts, a rough, brawling powerhouse who main evented all over the country. He wrestled Bruno Sammartino at Madison Square Garden. He headlined territories from the Northeast to the Gulf Coast. He was never the most graceful man in the ring, but nobody ever doubted for 1 second that he could hurt you. And in the wrestling business of that era, that was the entire point. Because here's the thing about the wrestling world Bill Watts came up in. Kayfabe wasn't a marketing strategy. It was a religion. The business protected its secrets the way governments protect state secrets. Wrestlers didn't admit the outcomes were predetermined. Heels and baby faces didn't travel together, didn't drink together, didn't even acknowledge each other in public. If a fan attacked you in a parking lot because he believed you were really the villain you played on television, that wasn't a crisis. That was proof you were doing your job. Watts absorbed all of it. And more than that, he built a philosophy around it. When he transitioned from wrestling into promoting, that philosophy became law. In 1979, Watts purchased the tri-state territory from longtime promoter Leroy McGuirk and rebranded it as Mid-South Wrestling. His kingdom covered Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi, with his base of operations in Shreveport. And from day one, Mid-South was different from every other territory in America. Watts ran his company like a football training camp, crossed with a military academy. Wrestlers had to be in shape, real shape. He instituted conditioning tests. He fined guys for being blown up in the ring. He demanded that every match, every promo, every angle be grounded in believability. Heels and baby faces dressed in separate locker rooms and were forbidden from being seen together in public. When a newspaper once casually mentioned that a departing wrestler would lose his final match on the way out of the territory, Watts changed the finish just to make the newspaper wrong and protect the business. His roster reflected his values. Ted DiBiase, a legitimate athlete and the son of a respected wrestling family. Jim Duggan, a former football player. Steve Williams, an actual four-time All-American amateur wrestler from Oklahoma who was so legitimately tough, his nickname was Dr. Death. The Big Cat, Ernie Ladd, a former American Football League star who had been one of the most feared defensive linemen of his generation. These were the kinds of men Bill Watts respected. Athletes, fighters, men whose toughness didn't require a costume. Watts would carry these convictions with him for the rest of his career. Years later, when he briefly ran WCW in the early 1990s, he famously banned moves off the top rope and stripped the product back to its grittiest fundamentals, because in his mind, believability was worth more than spectacle every single time. What Bill Watts did not respect was flash. Pretty boys, dancers, gimmick merchants, guys who got by on charisma instead of credibility. In his mind, that kind of performer was a parasite feeding on the believability that serious men had spent decades building. Wrestling was supposed to be a sport, a struggle, a fight you could believe in. It was not supposed to be a party. Which brings us to the man who broke every single one of those rules and somehow became the greatest star Bill Watts ever created. Sylvester Ritter was born on December 13, 1952, in Wadesboro, North Carolina, a small town in Anson County where opportunities for a young black man in the 1950s and the 1960s were limited and clearly marked. What Ritter had going for him was size, athleticism, and a work ethic that people noticed everywhere he went. He became a standout offensive lineman at Anson County High School and earned his way to Fayetteville State University, a historically black college in North Carolina, and there he thrived. Twice he earned honorable mention All-American honors. He was good enough to get drafted into professional football and spent time with the Green Bay Packers organization. He also did something a lot of professional athletes of his era never bothered with. He finished his degree. Sylvester Ritter graduated from Fayetteville State with a degree in political science. But the football dream ended the way football dreams usually end. His body gave out before his ambition did. Knee and back injuries closed the door on the NFL. And by the mid-1970s, Ritter was a large, gifted, well-educated athlete with nowhere to put any of it. Along the way, he had worked a job in a wrecking yard, an auto junkyard. And according to Ritter himself, his boss watched the way he worked, watched the way he stood his ground when he believed in something, and told him he was meaner than a junkyard dog. The name meant nothing at the time, just a compliment from a boss to a hard worker. Years later, it would be worth millions. Ritter turned to professional wrestling in 1977. He started in Tennessee, then made his way north to Calgary, Alberta, where he trained in the famous Hart family system, and worked for Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling under the name Big Daddy Ritter. He was learning, he was improving, but he was also just another big man in a business full of big men. Nothing about Big Daddy Ritter suggested a revolution was coming. Then he arrived in Shreveport, Louisiana, and he walked into the office of Cowboy Bill Watts. Now, on paper, this meeting should have gone nowhere. Ritter was not a polished technical wrestler. He would never be a polished technical wrestler. His matches were short, simple, and built around a handful of moves. By every measurable standard Bill Watts used to evaluate talent, Sylvester Ritter should have been a mid-card attraction at best. But Bill Watts, for all his rigidity, had one gift that separated him from almost every other promoter of his generation. He could recognize money when it walked through the door. And standing in his office was a man with something that couldn't be taught, couldn't be trained, and couldn't be faked. Ted DiBiase, who would go on to become one of the greatest performers in wrestling history, put it simply, the Junkyard Dog had charisma that can't be taught. It radiated off him. When Sylvester Ritter smiled, entire rooms smiled back. When he spoke, people leaned in. There was a warmth to the man, a genuine magnetic likability that no amount of amateur credentials could ever replicate. And there was something else Watts understood. Something most promoters of his era were too blind or too scared to act on. Mid-South wrestling ran through Louisiana and Mississippi. Cities like New Orleans, Shreveport, Baton Rouge, and Jackson. These were cities with enormous black populations. Communities full of passionate sports fans who had spent their entire lives watching wrestling shows where people who looked like them were presented as sidekicks, stereotypes, or stepping stones. No major territory in the South had ever built itself around a black hero. The conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. The conventional wisdom said white audiences in the Deep South would never accept it. Bill Watts looked at that conventional wisdom and made a decision that would define his legacy. He had help getting there. Ernie Ladd, the Big Cat, was more than just a performer in Mid-South. He was one of Watts's most trusted minds, a brilliant heel and an even more brilliant thinker who had spent years advocating for black wrestlers to be given real opportunities. Ladd saw what Ritter could become and pushed Watts to pull the trigger. Not as a token, not as a novelty. As the man, the absolute top of the territory. So Watts went to work. He took the nickname from that wrecking yard in North Carolina and built an entire identity around it. Sylvester Ritter became the Junkyard Dog. In the beginning, he pushed an actual shopping cart to the ring, loaded with scrap and junk, his junk wagon rattling down the aisle. Soon that evolved into the image that would become immortal. A thick steel chain attached to a dog collar around his neck. The word "Thump" printed across his trunks, named for his power slam finisher, and blasting over the loudspeakers as he walked out, a song that had just conquered the world. Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. Stop and think about what that entrance package actually was. A disco funk anthem, a costume built around a chain and a collar, a dance, because yes, the Junkyard Dog danced, hips swinging, crowd clapping along. It was pure spectacle, pure show business, pure flash. It was everything Bill Watts had spent his entire career despising. And Bill Watts didn't just tolerate it. He engineered it, he amplified it. Because the old cowboy had realized something that separated the great promoters from the merely stubborn ones. His rules about believability were never really about wrestling holds. They were about emotional truth. The audience had to believe. And the thing about the Junkyard Dog was that people believed in him more deeply than they believed in any technical wrestling masterpiece ever performed. The heat Watts took for this decision was immediate, and it came from the top of the industry. According to Jim Ross, who was working for Watts at the time and would go on to become the most famous announcer in wrestling history, Bob Geigel, the president of the National Wrestling Alliance itself, personally called Bill Watts with a warning. Putting a black wrestler on top of a Southern territory, Geigel said, would kill the business. Let that sink in. This wasn't some anonymous critic. This was the president of the governing body of professional wrestling telling one of his own promoters that his plan was commercial suicide. Bill Watts did it anyway. And here's where the genius of Watts as a booker comes into focus. Because Watts knew exactly what he had and exactly what he didn't have. He knew the Junkyard Dog was not a 60-minute wrestler. He knew that long technical matches would expose him. So Watts constructed an entire universe designed to protect his star and maximize his strengths. Junkyard Dog matches were short and explosive. Get in, headbutt, big comeback, thump, pin, celebrate. 3 minutes of pure electricity instead of 20 minutes of exposure. Watts surrounded him with some of the finest workers in the business, men like Ted DiBiase, Ernie Ladd, and Michael Hayes. Performers who could carry the technical load and make the Dog's simple offense feel like the wrath of a hero. Watts booked him strong. Impossibly strong. The Dog didn't get beaten clean. The Dog didn't beg. The Dog was presented, week after week, as the toughest, proudest, most unstoppable force in the territory. And the audience responded in a way that nobody, not even Watts, could have fully predicted. The Junkyard Dog didn't just become popular in Mid-South. He became a phenomenon. And then he became something bigger than a phenomenon. In New Orleans, he became something closer to a folk hero. Black fans who had never had a wrestling hero of their own filled arenas to see him. And here's the part that shattered the conventional wisdom forever. White fans filled those same arenas right beside them. Fathers brought their kids. Grandmothers screamed for the dog. In the Deep South, in the early 1980s, arenas full of black and white fans stood shoulder to shoulder and cheered in one voice for a black man wearing a chain and dancing to Queen. The president of the NWA said it would kill the business. Instead, the Junkyard Dog sold out the Louisiana Superdome. At his peak, the dog was reportedly earning $12,000 a week, an astronomical figure for a territory wrestler in that era, the kind of money reserved for national headliners and world champions. He sold out buildings on the strength of his name alone. Promoters in the territory learned a simple truth. If the Junkyard Dog was on the marquee, the building was full. If he wasn't, it wasn't. His merchandise flew off tables. When Mid-South ran its biggest shows at the Superdome in New Orleans, the Junkyard Dog was the man on the marquee, and tens of thousands of people answered the call. But money and attendance figures only tell you that the Junkyard Dog was a draw. They don't tell you why he mattered. To understand that, you have to understand the single greatest angle Bill Watts ever booked. The angle that turned a wrestling star into a legend. The blinding of the Junkyard Dog. It was 1980. The Fabulous Freebirds, a young trio of heels featuring Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts, were making noise in the territory. They were brash, arrogant, and hateable in the way only great heels can be. And Watts put them on a collision course with his hero. The setup was a hair match. The Junkyard Dog and his partner Buck Robley against the Freebirds, with the losers getting their heads shaved. But Watts, always thinking a layer deeper, planted a detail on commentary. The hair wouldn't be removed with scissors or a razor. It would be removed with a special hair removal cream. That cream became a loaded weapon. During the chaos of the match, the Freebirds took that cream and threw it directly into the eyes of the Junkyard Dog. And the Junkyard Dog went blind. Not injured, not angry. Blind. The heroic, invincible, dancing king of Mid-South was suddenly a man in darkness, and the territory treated it with the gravity of a real medical catastrophe. Because in Bill Watts's world, everything was treated with the gravity of reality. That was the whole point. What happened next is one of the most famous examples of commitment in the history of the business. Because the Junkyard Dog didn't just sell the blindness on television, he lived it. Bill Watts demanded total kayfabe from his roster, and Sylvester Ritter took that demand to a level almost nobody else would have. He wore his eye coverings in public. He wore them at home. He kept his blinds closed so he could uncover his eyes without being seen. If a fan might see him, the Junkyard Dog was blind. Period. And then real life handed the story a twist that no writer would have dared to script. In the middle of the blindness angle, Ritter's wife gave birth to their first child, his daughter. LaToya, Watts, ever the opportunist, folded reality into the story. The Junkyard Dog, the territory learned, could not see his own newborn daughter. A camera crew captured the dog at home, reaching toward his baby girl, his wife gently guiding his hand because he was pointing at the wrong spot. He could hold his child. He could hear her cry. But because of what the Freebirds had done, he could not see her face. The emotional response was volcanic. This wasn't wrestling heat anymore. This was something raw and more dangerous. Because the fans of Mid-South did not think they were watching a storyline. They thought they were watching a crime. Fans didn't just boo the Freebirds. Fans wanted to hurt them. Michael Hayes has told the story of confronting the blinded dog at a show when someone in the audience produced an actual weapon. ready to take matters into their own hands to defend a hero they believed was truly blind. Death threats poured in. The line between story and reality, the line Bill Watts had spent his whole career blurring, had all but disappeared. And through all of it, the Freebirds and the dog kept the story alive. Hayes mocked the blind man on television, strutting around in sunglasses, carrying a cane. The territory seethed. The anticipation built to unbearable levels. Everyone in Louisiana wanted one thing. They wanted the Junkyard Dog to get his hands on Michael Hayes. Watts made them wait for it. And then he gave it to them in the most dramatic package imaginable. A steel cage and a dog collar match. The dog and Hayes chained together at the neck. A stipulation with a built-in story logic that was almost poetic. A blind man doesn't need to see you if he's chained to you. There would be nowhere for Michael Hayes to run. The payoff came in front of a massive crowd, with the feud helping fuel a Superdome event, drawing close to 30,000 people. And in that cage, chained to his tormentor, the Junkyard Dog reached up and tore off his blindfold. His sight had returned. Michael Hayes was trapped in a locked cage, attached by a steel chain to a healthy, furious Junkyard Dog. Eyewitnesses say the roar that followed was unlike anything the territory had ever produced. The hero could see. The villain had nowhere to hide, and the Junkyard Dog took his revenge in front of a delirious crowd that had lived every second of the journey with him. That angle did more than draw money, though it drew mountains of it. It cemented a truth that Bill Watts, the great hater of Flash, had to sit with for the rest of his life. The biggest moment his territory ever produced had almost nothing to do with wrestling ability. No five-star classic, no technical masterpiece. It was a morality play, powered entirely by the audience's love for one man. A man Watts' own rulebook said should never have been on top. The years that followed were the golden age of Mid-South. The dog feuded with the giants of the territory, and every program printed money. His rivalry with Ted DiBiase became the spine of the promotion, a brutal personal saga between a beloved hero and a bitter former friend. When the dog lost a loser, Leaves Town match to DiBiase, Watts reached for another old wrestling trick, and the territory was soon graced by a mysterious masked man named Stagger Lee, who was built exactly like the Junkyard Dog, moved exactly like the Junkyard Dog, and hit a power slam exactly like the Junkyard Dog. The fans, in on the secret, loved every minute of it. Even the challengers to the NWA World Championship went through him, with Watts positioning the dog as an equal to the touring world champion Ric Flair. In the ecosystem of Mid-South, the Junkyard Dog wasn't just a star. He was the sun, but suns burn. And in the shadows behind the greatest run of his life, Sylvester Ritter was starting to come apart. The pressures were enormous, and they were pressures almost nobody else in the business could have understood. He wasn't just carrying a territory, he was carrying a symbol. Every night, in every town, he was the proof that the conventional wisdom was wrong, the proof Watts had staked his company on. He was making more money than he had ever seen. Living on the road, surrounded by every temptation the early 1980s nightlife could offer, and somewhere in that whirlwind, the substances found him. First as recreation, then as routine, then as need. Jim Cornette, who was in the territory at the time, later described watching the decline in real time. Toward the end of his Mid-South run, the dog slowed down dramatically. The weight started coming on. The explosive 3-minute bursts of energy that had defined him became harder to summon. The sharpest edge of his popularity began to dull, because audiences can feel it when the electricity dims, even if they can't name what changed. Bill Watts could see it too, but before the story could resolve itself in Mid-South, it was interrupted by a force that was about to swallow the entire territorial system whole: Vince McMahon. By 1984, the World Wrestling Federation was expanding nationally, tearing through the old territorial boundaries and shopping for stars with a checkbook nobody could match. And Vince McMahon shopped aggressively in Bill Watts' backyard. Mid-South was hit as hard as any territory in the country. And the biggest prize on the shelf was the Junkyard Dog. The way it ended tells you everything about how much it hurt. The Junkyard Dog didn't sit down with Bill Watts. He didn't give notice. He didn't drop the titles or put over a successor on his way out. The sacred ritual of the territorial era. One day, the biggest star in Mid-South history was simply gone. No goodbye, no handshake. The man Watts had bet his business on, the man he had protected and elevated and defended against the entire industry, walked out the door and surfaced on WWF television. For a man who had defied the president of the NWA for him, who had absorbed the criticism of an entire industry for him, who had built the machinery of a whole territory around protecting him, the silence of that exit cut deeper than any insult ever could. Watts was furious, and by every account, wounded in a way that went beyond business. He had Butch Reed, he had Jim Duggan. He would build new stars because building stars was what Bill Watts did. But there was no replacing the Junkyard Dog, and Watts knew it. The partnership that changed Southern wrestling forever ended not with a celebration, but with an empty locker. And here's the cruel irony of what came next. Because the WWF got the Junkyard Dog's name, his chain, his music, and his smile. But it never got the thing that made him immortal. In Mid-South, the Junkyard Dog was a serious man in a serious world. A fighter, a father blinded by villains, a hero whose victories felt like justice. In the WWF, he became an attraction, a dancing, crowd-pleasing mid-card act who brought children into the ring to boogie with him after matches. And to be clear, he was wonderful at it. The New York crowds adored him. He won the Wrestling Classic tournament in 1985, the main attraction of one of the company's earliest pay-per-view experiments. He shared marquees with Hulk Hogan. He had memorable programs with Greg Valentine and a genuinely heated feud with King Harley Race, headbutting his way into WrestleMania history. But he was never positioned as the man. Never a world champion, never the center of the story. The role Bill Watts had built for him, the role of the unstoppable folk hero, simply did not exist in Vince McMahon's cartoon universe, where there was only one son and its name was Hulkamania. The dog thrived as a supporting character, and the substances kept their grip. The weight kept climbing. By 1988, his WWF run was over. Runs in WCW followed, including a stretch challenging Ric Flair, along with appearances anywhere the name Junkyard Dog could still draw. And it could still draw because the love never fully went away. It just got further and further from the top of the mountain. Through the 1990s, Sylvester Ritter fought the same fight so many men of his generation fought, against the habits the road had given him. And by the accounts of those who knew him, he was genuinely trying to win it. Ted DiBiase, his greatest rival and longtime friend, said the dog worked hard to get clean, even returning to a boot camp-style rehabilitation program to help young people avoid the road he had traveled. He stayed close to the business, wrestling independents, training young talent, appearing at an Extreme Championship Wrestling pay-per-view in May of 1998 to a hero's ovation from a new generation of fans who knew exactly who he was. 1 month later, he made a promise to his daughter. LaToya Ritter, the baby girl born during the blindness angle, the child her father once pretended he could not see so the story would stay true, was graduating from high school in Wadesboro, North Carolina. Her father asked for the weekend off from an independent booking because he was not going to miss it. And he didn't. On graduation day, Sylvester Ritter was there, watching his daughter walk across that stage. On June 2, 1998, driving home to Mississippi along Interstate 20 near the town of Forest, he lost control of his car. Reports indicated he had fallen asleep at the wheel after the long journey. The vehicle left the road and rolled. Sylvester Ritter passed away at the scene. He was 45 years old. The wrestling world mourned, and the tributes poured in from every corner of the business. But one reaction stands out above all the others. Bill Watts, the hardest man in professional wrestling, the promoter who had every reason to hold a grudge over the way things ended, broke down and cried. He admitted it openly in the years that followed. He wept for the Junkyard Dog. And what haunted him most was the simplest thing of all. He never got to say goodbye. In 2004, the night before WrestleMania 20, the Junkyard Dog was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. The man who presented the induction was Ernie Ladd, the big cat, the man who had pushed Bill Watts to believe all those years earlier. and accepting the honor on her father's behalf was LaToya Ritter, the daughter he could not bear to miss seeing graduate. In a heartbreaking postscript, LaToya herself passed away in 2011 at just 31 years old, a final tragedy in a family that had already given so much. So what do we make of Bill Watts and the Junkyard Dog? What do we make of a partnership that, by every rule either man understood, should never have worked? Start with what it accomplished, because the record is staggering. In an era when the president of the NWA warned that a black champion would kill a Southern territory, Bill Watts made the Junkyard Dog the North American champion and the highest-paid, most protected star in his company. The Superdome sold out, the business boomed, and a decade later, when Watts ran WCW, he did it again, putting the World Championship on Ron Simmons and making him the first black world champion of a major American promotion. Mick Foley once observed that creating a black babyface and building the company around him was simply what Bill Watts did. The Junkyard Dog was where that legacy began. And it matters that Watts never framed any of it as charity. In his telling, it was never about making a statement. The Junkyard Dog drew money. The Junkyard Dog moved tickets. The Junkyard Dog was, by the only measurement that ever mattered to Bill Watts, the best man for the job. There is something almost more powerful in that framing than in any noble speech. The most stubborn traditionalist in wrestling looked at the Deep South in 1980, ignored the entire industry, and bet on talent. And talent won. But the deeper lesson is the one hiding inside the title of this video. Because Bill Watts really did hate flashy wrestlers. That part was never an act. He hated style without substance, sizzle without steak, performers who used charisma as a costume to hide their emptiness. What the Junkyard Dog taught him, and what the Junkyard Dog proved to the entire industry, is that there is a difference between flash and connection. The chain, the music, the dancing, the shopping cart full of junk. None of it was the point. The point was that when the Junkyard Dog looked out at an arena, 20,000 people felt like he was looking at them. Children believed in him. Grandparents believed in him. Black fans and white fans in Louisiana and Mississippi in 1980 stood together and believed in him at the same time. That isn't flash. That's the rarest substance in the entire business. And Bill Watts, the great enemy of style, recognized real substance the moment it walked into his office wearing a smile. They don't make partnerships like that anymore. The gruff old cowboy and the dancing dog. The rulebook and the exception that proved it. Two men who should have repelled each other like opposite ends of a magnet. And instead built something that broke barriers, packed stadiums, and changed the direction of an entire industry. Bill Watts hated flashy wrestlers. Until he met the Junkyard Dog. And professional wrestling has never been the same since. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.